So this is my presentation on emergent objects in Worktable. Move one little thing around here on the screen so I can actually see what I'm doing. How does your favorite mug, blanket, or pair of glasses shape you? Questions about objects and our relationships to them guide Kate McIntosh's Worktable, a participatory performance exploring the ways we understand mundane objects. In Worktable, isolated participants move between a series of rooms. First, they select an object from a large range provided, such as an apple, a typewriter, or a watch. They clock in with a host who records their entry time and then takes them into a private room. There, a sign tells them to deconstruct their chosen object using tools provided. You can see that in the slide on the screen. Once done, they move on to the next room, where they give this deconstructed object away. Then they select the remains of another participant's deconstruction and are instructed to rebuild this new object however they choose. Working by themselves, but in a room with other participants, they may use provided tape, glue, and some simple tools for this rebuilding, with these materials shared among the room's users. New object constructed, they place their creation in the last room. This is a gallery of others like it, where participants see the combined results of everyone's work from that run of the show. Finally, they clock out with a host back in the main lobby who records their exit time and chats with participants if they wish. Now, in this paper, I'm going to take you through the ways that, through its dramaturgy, Worktable asks us to consider objects as active agents in constructing our social world collectively. Through its object-focused actions, it explores the way our small-scale interactions with each other and the material things around us iterate to emergently create our larger material and social world. In doing so, it gives participants a way to practically explore how they can make a meaningful impact on this larger world through these smaller interactions. And, as a nice bonus, lets them see the results of their collective creation manifested through both its final gallery and its process as a whole. Come on. There we go. Worktable relies on what we've come to call a dramaturgy of emergence. Now, Stephen Johnson defines emergence as a higher level pattern arising out of parallel complex interactions between local agents. In science, it describes a process in which a decentralized network of phenomena interact to generate something new with qualities meaningfully different than those of the network's component parts. This is a creation process that isn't led by any single participant. Instead, rules and frameworks guide components' interactions with each other. Over time, these interactions build through iteration, with actions generating loops of reactions, and together, these generate new, more complex phenomena with qualities meaningfully different than those of any of their components. This means that emergent processes create in ways that are tied to their specific components, but are guided by the aggregate of their interactions rather than any one leader. Classic example of this in nature is the ant colony. Rather than a single ant dispensing complex instructions, colonies are guided by the decentralized outcome of interactions between many different ants. And as these interactions iterate, they produce the larger entity of a colony, which is capable of complex activities like farming, nurture, and food gathering, despite the fact that any single ant isn't necessarily going to know how to do this overall complex system. When applied to participatory performances as a dramaturgical structure, emergence offers a playful form that embraces the contributions of all its participants while creating something that's bigger than any one of them alone. By building dramaturgies around iterating interactions guided by shared guidelines, artists can create shows whose experiences and outcomes come from the combined impact of their iterating actions and agencies. Dramaturgies of emergence articulate the values of emergent strategy outlined by social justice theorist and activist Adrienne Maree Brown. In her book, Emergent Strategy, Brown articulates a politics of emergence which embraces transformation and adaptation, creating these through small-scale iterative interactions between people, which become reflected in the large-scale outcomes of movements. This structure relies on decentralized organization, which participants define and redefine around shared guiding values and frameworks. Emergent strategies work to create, in Brown's words, ways for humans to practice being in right relationship to our home and each other, to practice complexity, and grow a compelling future together through relatively simple interactions. Emergent strategy is how we intentionally change in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated worlds we long for. Dramaturgies of emergence articulate these values in a theatrical form. They embrace the contributions of artists and audience participants by having participants interact in decentralized iterative ways within a shared framework. And they give people a way to creatively and collaboratively practice the kinds of relationality and iterative complexity Brown talks about, as well as see the impact of their interactions manifest in real time. Worktable structure makes it a great example of one of these dramaturgies of emergence. By having participants exchange their objects before rebuilding them, the show makes them iterate off of each other's decisions. Participants also find themselves reacting and building off of each other as they negotiate and share the tools available for rebuilding their objects. At the end of the process, they're able to see the combined results of their work manifested as the final gallery of objects and understand their choices as part of a larger collective whole. However, Worktable also complicates our understanding of these dramaturgies, with objects rather than humans being the primary point of interaction. Outside people's interactions with the hosts on entering and exiting the performance and maybe asking to share a particular tool during the rebuilding phase, audience participants don't interact with or affect each other directly, but instead are responding to each other's choices through the objects they work with. And this forces them and us to more closely consider the role of the objects in this decentralized creation network that makes up the show. Good place to start this exploration is with actor network theory, or ANT. Popularized by sociologist Bruno Latour in his book Reassembling the Social, ANT sees society as formed and driven not by big, overarching, abstract social forces, but by the aggregate agencies of lots of smaller social actors interacting with, around, and against each other to produce a kind of mesh of associations. In his view, the social stuff of the world is what is glued together by many other kinds of connectors. And as actors constantly define and redefine society as their relationships shift and change, they produce meaningful but never quite stable ways of understanding this idea of the social. As they do, they become either, and changing back and forth, intermediaries and mediators to the social. Intermediaries here are what transport meaning or force without changing it or transforming it, while mediators transform, translate, distort, or modify the meaning of whatever social elements they're carrying. Now, when mediators affect the world, they change it through their interactions with it, giving them a kind of social agency through this effect. Importantly, these kind of mediating actors aren't just humans. They include anything that modifies a state of affairs and makes a difference. And so this means that actors and mediators can be shared social constructs, groups, institutions, or, importantly for us, objects. An object's nature and its relationships with the world impact its interactions with people, often in ways we can't easily predict. Objects don't only transmit understandings of our social world as intermediaries, they actively shape our understanding of it as mediators in their own right. Worktable's objects beautifully exemplify this idea. Like ANT, dramaturgies of emergence, like worktables, rely on linked networks of actors, making choices based on those around them. As Latour points out, even the most routine, traditional, and silent implements stop being taken for granted when they're approached by users rendered ignorant and clumsy by distance, such as when we're introduced to them in a way that makes them novel or new. By having its human participants interact with their chosen objects rather than each other, Worktable pushes its audience to pay attention to the impact of these objects on their actions, and through these, the wider network of relationships and meanings they're transmitting and mediating. As participants take apart and reassemble these otherwise everyday objects, they consider not only their own relationship to their chosen object and the choices that its materiality gets them to make, but also the complexity of these objects' relationships with the other people around them, which are especially made clear when they're asked to reassemble an object deconstructed by someone else. This means that participants now have to consider their own relationship to the object and its wider world, but also to the specific other person who has worked with that object. This whole relationship is also mediated entirely by the object itself. You don't get to ask the other person questions about what their thoughts were when they took it apart. You just have to figure out your relationship to the object through what it now materially is saying to you. And that means that the object itself is working as an agent in its own transformation. This raises an important question. How can an object have agency? Theorist and philosopher Jane Bennett argues that they can, and in her book, Vibrant Matter, she proposes the idea of thing power, which is the curious ability of inanimate objects or inanimate things to animate, to act, and to produce effects dramatic and subtle. This thing power arises from their fundamental existence as material, unique things. And it means that they also exist constantly in relation to other things. They enhance their power, in her words, as a heterogeneous assemblage. Things affect the world around them and are affected by it, and the way they do so depends on their specific and vital materiality. This means that objects, that actors, humans or objects, never act alone, but always in relationship to each other. And Bennett argues that what this suggests is that agency, the kind of efficacy or effectivity to which that term refers to, becomes distributed across an assembly of actors rather than just in any one specific person in the network or in any one specific object. And this is what she calls an agency of assemblages, where, well, each member of the network has a certain amount of impact on it. The overall network also has an agency of its own as an assembled thing. This is an explicitly emergent phenomenon with no single leader and effects distinct from the sum of each material actor involved. And as such, it gives us a way to understand the choices of this collective network as more than just the sum decisions of its component actors, but as a new decision-making thing in its own right, in a way that is very much motivated by and includes the objects within it. With this in mind, we can view deconstructed and reconstructed objects, like those in Worktable, as forceful parts of this assembled agency, and as agency possessing actors in their own right. While human actors are a big part of the show's networked agency, so are the objects, as we've talked about, mediating their own transformations and influencing the show's final gallery and the meanings attached to it through their specific vital materiality. This means that the material outcomes of the show's galleries and the meanings its processes manifest are made possible by this emergent reaction between humans and objects in a network. And by isolating human participants to mostly interactions with objects rather than other people, Worktable highlights the role of these objects in the network. This understanding of how Worktable highlights objects has important consequences for the show's larger social reflections. These are best illustrated, I think, through Macintosh's own story of the inspiration behind Worktable, which grew out of a major earthquake in Aotearoa, or New Zealand. Experiencing the event from another city in the country, she describes everyone constantly ready for the walls to tumble, floors to cave in, windows to explode, always ready to dive under a table, a bed. She says it was terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Macintosh reflects that imagining this instant dismantling of human constructions that seemed so solid and sedimented, so inescapable, which he refers to as the colonial monuments, the 80s office buildings, the highways, playing out this impermanence over and over began to feel strangely liberating, freeing, as if opening the way for a great movement. Seemingly inspired by this imagination, she describes Worktable as an earthquake in miniature that takes place in our own hands. In Macintosh's words, the objects that are taken apart in Worktable are domestic, familiar, the kind we use every day, and they have different meanings for different people. But these objects also embody ways of doing and ways of thinking that are inscribed in everyday life, that are known as normal. Taking these objects apart releases them from those fixed roles and uses, from their inscription in the normal, and brings them back to their constituent parts, their basic materials, ready to change. Based on these insights, it seems Macintosh intended the show's dramaturgy to highlight not only the transformative power objects carry and the agency they articulate by doing so, but also to bring attention, especially through this lens of the earthquake, to the wider social applications of this dramaturgy, which are very much in line with the understanding of emergence that Brown articulates. By having participants explore the role of objects as mediating actors in their lives and reflect on their own roles in contributing to a much wider distributed agency among a larger network within the performance, Worktable gives its participants a contained, practical way to understand themselves as agents in a larger, iteratively generated collective society, composed of both human and, importantly, non-human actors. It creates a framework for participants to, in Brown's words, grow a compelling future together through relatively simple interactions, by understanding and actively embracing the relationality with the web of other actors in their lives. In doing so, Worktable lets its human participants explore their own capacity for transformation and adaptation in the context of this relationality, while at the same time practicing a wider understanding of their capacity to create impactful social change through small interactions as part of larger collective networks. Now, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Macintosh on the performance, because I think for me, it really sums up what the power of this piece is. She asks, after the earthquake, an imaginary figure walks into the city of rubble and picks up a broken brick. What should she do with it? Others join and a discussion ensues. Should the bricks be used to rebuild the city as it was, honoring its history? Should the rubble be swept into the sea and a new city designed from scratch? Should everyone just forget this happened and walk over the mountain to join another city there? And I think for me, that is the central question of Worktable. In this mesh of other people and assembled actors and both humans and objects, what should we and the brick do?